The purpose for this lesson, I have several different reasons, and one of them is just to give you some tips. Tips that I use with my own mentees, tips that I believe will help you, tips that I believe will just make it a little bit easier to understand how to create a really great Chapter 2 in your proposal and dissertation. This is what I call a sound approach. It's a logical approach. It's not just deciding, what to put in there based on your ideas or what you've got in Chapter 1. Of course, some of this is going to align with Chapter 1 and what you've indicated in your purpose statement and when you identified your variables and independent variables, whether they be based on your research questions or anything else that you may have alluded to through your hypotheses. But I'm going to give you a sound approach to be able to write your Chapter 2. I'm going to give you some other ideas on the importance of the content that you need to put in this chapter to create a really good, informative story that'll inform the reader and give the reader a better understanding about what you saw when you did your review of the literature. I'm going to set an image for creation, if you will, on the outline and how you can literally take your dependent and independent variables and the interrelationships and get a quick understanding about how much you need to write, or at least give you a basic ballpark figure that says, you know what, if you're going to write a Chapter 2, it should be at least 30 pages, and this is how those 30 pages might look when they're constructed. The dependent variable. I'll discuss first the dependent variable because this is the first thing I believe you need to write in Chapter 2. You already have identified your independent variable, and ideally you have one. If you have more than one, I think you need to have a conversation with your dissertation chair, because remember, this is a doctoral dissertation. This is where you're learning how to do research. Try not to make it too complex. I only allow my mentees to have one dependent variable. If you're going to do something that's more complex, that's certainly fine, but for the nature of what I do and what I'm going to describe here, there'll be one dependent variable in your study. And what I tell my mentees is to write 7 to 10 pages of information purely on the dependent variable. You have to decide, of course, what your dependent and independent variables are. But once you have decided those, you would have already written Chapter 1, or at least would have identified what your variables are. And so you can look at that dependent variable and consider in drafting your work. Here's the first part of the image of Chapter 2 on how long it will be and what it will be comprised of, is to say that roughly 7 to 10 pages are going to be about your dependent variable. In this 7 to 10 pages, you're going to give a little bit of a history and trends information. You'll perhaps write some information about where your dependent variable originated. If by chance you're doing something in quality management, which is an area that I do a lot of work in, or process improvement, I might start with something with Frederick Taylor's work back in the early 1900s and give some history and some trend information to bring the reader up to what's going on today with the literature. What's the most common literature today that supports and refutes what I am writing about. Remember, as you write your literature review, it's not just about taking one side, but it's about providing all the different outlooks that's available, if you will, from other people in the field of study. Then you get into what's going on today in the current situation. You may spend a page or two, maybe 3 pages, giving some information about the trends. And then you'll spend the other 3 or 4 or 5 pages about what's going on in the current situation. Now, current, I refer to this as within about the last 5 years or so. This way, the reader will have had the opportunity to gain insights about the history or any pertinent trends in the content that relates to your dependent variable, and then they're getting that current situation. Any critical factors or points that have been instrumental or milestones in the content area that you're writing about, perhaps the topic of leadership, and we see that maybe there are different types of leadership models or theories that came available, such as situational leadership, contingency leadership, transactional leadership. And these are the critical factors where these models first came on scene, if you will. The time the originators, the subject matter experts, or the journal authors have written about their models and perhaps how they were used, maybe even given some relationships early on about why it came to be. Was it because there was a financial crisis or a war situation? Was it because people were getting laid off on a regular basis and we're going through some sort of financial economic crisis, which borne out some sort of new model or philosophy? You always want to give, as I mentioned, similar and different or divergent views of the material, of the literature. There's always somebody out there who doesn't agree with the standard approach, and we want to know what those are. If you're going to do what we call an exhaustive review of the literature, you're going to be looking at both sides. In essence, you're going to be doing a bit of a comparison and contrast. You're also going to be synthesizing the many different points of view, and then the outcome of that synthesis would be perhaps your analysis and evaluation. These are higher order critical thinking skills. In essence, what you're doing in Chapter 2 are displaying your higher order critical thinking skills to reflect upon all the different literature that you looked at and different sources and resources that you included in Chapter 2 to give some assessment, if you will, or that evaluation from your own point of view based on how you interpreted all the literature. The independent variables. Now what I'm going to do is share some insights on the independent variable or variables on how to allude to those. Predominantly, everything's the same with a few exceptions, and so I'm going to put all the items up here, realizing that's only the first two that are any different. Ideally, you don't want to have any more than 3 independent variables. If you start to have more than 3, you might be extending your study farther than it needs to go. Now, this is situational. I have had a mentee that has had as many as 11 independent variables, and that was fine because the study called for it, but it was not something that I encouraged. But since there was a correlation between a program's set variables, and there were 11 of them, the student or the doctoral candidate at the time had to do all 11 of them. So it's a lot of statistical analysis, which is fine, but oftentimes students want to do more than they need to do. And this could be problematic, particularly if this is your first time doing a study, and particularly if you're not very good with understanding and running statistics. So I suggest that you have no more than 3 independent variables. Now, I like to look at it that if you have 3 independent variables, you have 3 research questions and 3 null hypotheses to test. Therefore, making it what I call a clean study, as I explained in Chapter 1 when I talked about the different pieces of information, such as the research questions and the variables there. Moving from that point is that now I tell my mentees, or encourage you to consider writing 4 to 6 pages on each independent variable. Remember, on the dependent variable a few minutes ago, I talked about having perhaps maybe 7 to 10 pages on the dependent variable. Each independent variable does not need to have the same amount of information, and I encourage you to have somewhat of a balance of information for independent variables. If you're going to have 5 pages for independent variables, then try to make it so that you have about 5 for each, and not one independent variable has 5 pages, another one has 7, another one has 9 pages. Try to keep a balance in your work. This will be easily seen by the reader if it's not balanced later. So again, about 4 to 6 pages of each, and the same kinds of information you had on the dependent variable, except you do not have to go as in-depth for the history and the trending information. The current situation, critical factors and points are similar in different views. Still, you want to allude to those, but you don't have to go as deep as you did on the dependent variable, because the independent variables, as I see it, are lesser of importance than the dependent variable. Now, you may hear different from your dissertation chair that you need to have as many pages on average for each independent variable as you do dependent variable. Well, then, of course, then you need to follow the guidance of your dissertation chair. Or some may say just make each one as long as it needs to be. Again, that's guidance that's not incorrect, just guidance that I don't align well to. So if you had 3 independent variables, for example, and you wrote 6 pages on each one, you would have roughly 18 pages. If you tag in the other 7 to 10 pages on your dependent variable, roughly you can see you already have about 28 or more pages in your chapter 2. So it's very easy to get 30 pages when you break it down this way. Now, the next part is once you have written your dependent variable information and all the content that you're going to write for each of the independent variables, now you have to show some relationships. You need to present those relationships and perhaps interrelationships between all the independent variables and the dependent variable. This section would come after you have written all the information on your final independent variable. So let's say, for example, you have 1 dependent variable and 3 independent variables. As far as flow, from the beginning to the end of the chapter, you would start your chapter off with an introduction. You then give some information about where you found all your literature. That was covered in a prior lesson in chapter 2 that I gave a couple weeks ago. And then you would have the information about the dependent variable, each of the independent variables, and now this is where the relationships and interrelationships information comes in. I encourage you not to put this into all your dependent variable and independent variable writings because it can get kind of cumbersome in there. Here I suggest you do it after the final independent variable. This section should be roughly 4 to 10 pages, depending on the complexity of your work and how the relationships are as far as depth and how interrelated they are. But I see dissertations, I mean normal in the sense of average, to be about 4 pages long, maybe 6. But if you have a complex study, you may need to go up to 10. If you have less independent variables, you're going to have less pages here. If you're going to have a dependent variable and 3 independent variables, you'll probably be closer to 6 to 8 pages, where perhaps if you only have 2 independent variables, maybe you're closer to 4 pages. Here again, you might want to add a figure. Many people like doing a mind map. I shared some information about the mind map in a prior lesson, and I'm going to create another lesson that's directed solely at creating a mind map on how to do it with some of the examples that I have used myself. You may also want to have a timeline in here. There's nothing wrong with putting a timeline of where the dependent independent variables cross paths, if you will. Oftentimes, this adds another level of breadth and depth to your work. These figures are not necessarily required, nor are they always going to be conducive for your work. But if it's something you want to add because you believe it will add value, then by all means do include that mind map and timeline. And there may be other information that you believe is important to include as well. Chapter 2 is a chapter which could be very subjective on what you put into it. Some people just like a narrative. Many dissertation chairs will suggest you not put in any more tables or figures than are needed. I don't necessarily agree with that. My choice is that oftentimes a figure and a table is much like a picture that's worth 1,000 words. Oftentimes, when you have 30 pages of content without any tables or figures, it can be a laborious read. I always look at what is the result of this chapter, not when you're done with it, not when the dissertation's approved, but 2 or 3 years later from now when somebody's trying to read your work and gain some insights off your content development. For them, I believe the mind map and the timeline could be very conducive to help them better understand quicker what's in your work. The example I'm going to provide is from one of my mentees. And in this example, it is a bit of a narrative, and I'm just going to show how he alluded to the information, what was covered in Chapter 2. Because there's so much variation, it's hard for me to actually show you information from a dissertation. Ideally, I would suggest that you then go into ProQuest Dissertations and download 1 or 2 dissertations that are perhaps in your area of study, particularly if you're doing a quantitative study. Then look at how they wrote and created all the content in Chapter 2 based on their dependent and independent variables. My mentee's work that I'm providing here was approved on the first through for his proposal and dissertation, and he has given me his consent to use his work. He owns the copyright on it. I just happen to own the copyright on this program, taking the B out of ABD, but it's all his work, and he's given me consent to use it to help you see some examples. And so the example I'm going to share with you is from Dr. Joseph Hagee. His dissertation was published in 2013, titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study. Now, the reason I use his work is because he won Dissertation of the Year for a quantitative study. I believe if you want to see how somebody put together a very in-depth, very well-developed and presented dissertation, you should go into ProQuest Dissertations and download his dissertation. It is rich in content and information. Even if it's not related to your content of study or topic of study, you might look at it for how he constructed his dissertation and perhaps emulate some of his writing styles. There's nothing wrong with that. He started out his chapter with this information. Chapter 2 features reviews of the scholarly literature that surround the conceptual framework of this study, including leadership practices, leadership styles, religions, religiosity, spirituality in the workplace, differences between leadership and management, religious practices, stereotypes, and biases. You can gain a sense for what are the variables of the literature which are captured in his chapter 2 just by looking at this first sentence of the paragraph. I'm going to show you next two other sentences that he had that's part of this paragraph. He goes into suggesting the theoretical definitions and foundations of leadership, religion, and religiosity are discussed first, followed by a discussion about the relationships among religion, religiosity, and leadership practices. So you might be able to get a mental image of how he constructed chapter 2. At least you're starting to see the flow of information and how he put it together. And then he concludes that paragraph with, this chapter concludes with a discussion of organizational cultures in Lebanon, followed by a summary of leadership styles and religions. His study was done in Lebanon, so therefore he felt, and I agree, that it was important that he gave some information about the organizational cultures in Lebanon, because if you weren't sure where this study was done, some of the information that you would read from his work could be confusing otherwise. So he wanted to make sure he grounded his literature review by giving some information about those organizational cultures that are found in Lebanon. Together, a chapter 2 for a qualitative study.